Hi everyone, welcome. This is a video about the Code of Ethics, an introduction to the Code of Ethics, and really an introduction to the process of ethical reasoning. Let me just take a second and sort of orient you to how this week's information fits into the rest of the information or the sort of process of the semester. So this week we're going to read the Code of Ethics, and there's a link to that on Moodle, and then we're going to read a couple of sort of criticisms and opportunities for improvement for the Code of Ethics, and that comes in the form of the Freud and Krug papers and the Woodcock paper. So let me tell you sort of how these fit into what we're doing this semester. So by the end of this week, you should know what the 4 sections of the NASW Code of Ethics are and have some idea of what their function is. The Code of Ethics is linked on Moodle. There's a link to it, so you'll spend some time reading that link. You should also have a beginning familiarity with the content of each section. Now, the beginning familiarity piece is a little little dependent on which section we're talking about. The preamble is pretty short. The purpose is, again, pretty short. The standard section, though, is actually quite long, and so it's going to take much more time to develop some familiarity with that particular section. But at least some beginning familiarity with the content of each section. Then know a few limitations of the code, and again, that'll come from the Freud and Krug article and the Woodcock article. And then 2 things really to understand by the end of the week. The first is the basic features of ethical reasoning, which we're going to talk about in this lecture. And then the second is really something that I'm passing along to you implicitly. So we're not going to talk about it, and you're not going to read about it, but you have to sort of develop an appreciation that the Code of Ethics is something you're going to consult often, both as a student and as a professional social worker. So with that said, let's get into the content of this week's lecture. So, as we said last week, there's 4 big sections in the NASW Code of Ethics: the preamble, the purpose, the ethical principles, and then the ethical standards. As I said a second ago, the preamble is pretty short. Purpose is fairly short. Principles is pretty short, but it's the standards that's really sort of the lengthy one, and that's really where I spend a lot of my time when I consult the NASW Code of Ethics. It's where I spend a lot of my time when I was doing clinical practice, and it's certainly where I spend a lot of my time now when I'm consulting the Code of Ethics. So, what does the preamble do? I keep moving myself around here. So the preamble summarizes our professional mission and our values. So here's an example of where the mission is captured in the Code of Ethics. Our mission really is to enhance human well-being and help meet the basic needs of all people. And now within that sort of short statement, and I realize I've only read about half of what I put on the slide here, within that short statement, there's a pretty broad latitude for different kinds of social work, so that doesn't necessarily limit social work to just clinical practice or just macro work or just work with groups or organizations or communities or something like that. But that sort of represents the broad swath of everything that social work encompasses. Now, I think the second part of that statement is actually one of the hallmark statements of the social work profession. So we enhance well-being and help meet the basic needs of all people, but especially those who are vulnerable, oppressed, or living in poverty. And that's been sort of the focus of our profession throughout history. We are constantly sort of attending to people that no one else is interested in helping with, or in helping. The preamble also summarizes our values, and those values are the 6 things I have listed here: service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, importance of human relationships, integrity, and competence. We're going to come back to those values when we get down a couple of sections here in a second. The mission and values are rooted really in the historical activities of our profession, and they're really what make us unique among all helping professions. So there wasn't necessarily ever a time when we all decided we were going to agree on these. We we rooted these values in sort of what people have been doing throughout the history of social work in the past 150 years. Let me just advance the slide here. So then the second section is the purpose of the code. And there's 6 main purposes in this section. It identifies our core values. It summarizes our broad ethical principles. It helps with professional decision making. It provides accountability to 2 different groups. The first is the public. The second is to colleagues. And then it's actually the 5th thing, but I'm talking about it last year. The 6th purpose of the code really is a teaching tool. It's designed to help students become socialized into the profession. 2 important things to note in this section. One is that students are expected to adhere to the Code of Ethics. And we're unique among helping professionals in that we encourage students to identify as professional social workers, but then expect that they adhere to the same ethical standards that professional practicing social workers do. The real role of the purpose of the Code of Ethics was to help provide some professionalization and some standardization of our profession. So it helped us professionalize, and then it helped sort of standardize what social workers in different parts of the country and different parts of the world were doing. The ethical principles, this is now, we're in the 3rd section here. So this is where we come back to the values identified in that first section. So it identifies a value and a corresponding ethical principle. And this is exactly why we spent a few weeks discussing the distinction between values and ethics, right? And so this is interestingly where they overlap, but where we see sort of the role of a value and the role of the ethical principle. So this is one that I just spend a lot of time thinking about. So the value here that I'm just illustrating for a second is social justice, and the ethical principle is that social workers challenge social injustice. And if you think back to how we define values and ethics, this fits perfectly with what we talked about in class. So a value is an aspirational statement. It tells us what we should aspire to. It tells us what's good, right? An ethical principle, on the other hand, tells us what to do in the moment. And really, challenging social injustice is sort of something that's done in the moment in order to achieve a value. So ethical principles are sort of those short-term activities that help us achieve those long-term values. There is a brief explanation. This is borrowed from the Code of Ethics. Social workers pursue social change, particularly with and on behalf of, it's a typo on the slide, vulnerable and oppressed groups and individuals. So that's sort of the Code's justification for how these values and ethical principles correspond with one another. The ethical principles really set forth these ideals to which we aspire. The last section, and by far the longest section, I mean by far, you'll see it when you click on, or if you have already, you'll see it when you click on the link at the NASW Code of Ethics. Ethical standards are really a mix of enforceable guidelines for professional conduct and a mix of sort of aspirational standards. So the standards govern just about every single professional activity a social worker will engage in. That includes clinical work, learning and mentoring and supervision, advocacy, training. It governs just about every part of the professional life of a social worker, from really the beginning of the day to the end of the day, and everything in between. There's sort of 6 domains of ethical standards. We listed those out last week. I've listed them out here again. But again, the thing I want to sort of emphasize here is that the Code of Ethics makes no claims about the prioritization of any one ethical standard over another. And this helps us determine what an ethical dilemma is, which we'll get to in a second. But I just want to emphasize that. There's a bunch of ethical standards here and 6 domains of ethical standards. but there is no prescriptive ranking about which standards or which domains of standards are more important than another. So, a couple of things to consider here, and I'm just going to move myself so you can see all the text on the slide here. So the code is rather detailed. It has sections on just about all of the aspects of professional life. So think about for a second what constitutes one's professional life. Your professional life isn't just limited to the times that you're meeting with clients. Your professional life also includes behavior in staff meetings, behavior in supervision or consultation, behavior during times when you're seeking continuing education, or times when you've got to go off site for a meeting for something. Professional life includes coffee breaks, lunchtime or downtime with colleagues, bumping into someone in the hall and chatting for a second. That constitutes professional life. And we have to acknowledge that the code of ethics governs our behavior even during those times that we don't necessarily consider that formally our professional life. They are, in fact, our professional life. A couple other things to consider about the code. It has both concrete and abstract ideas. And then this is really the most important thing to probably remember about the code. It can contradict itself. And so a second ago, when I said on the previous slide that there's no rank ordering of ethical standards or the domains, this gives us insight into what constitutes an ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma happens when two or more ethical standards are in conflict. And there's another mistake in the slide here. Let me fix that real quick. Okay, fix that typo. I misspelled conflict. So ethical dilemmas happen when two or more ethical standards are in conflict, and that happens quite frequently. That comes from sort of the code's length, the fact that it's fairly comprehensive, and the fact that it contains both concrete and abstract ideas. So again, I want to emphasize this at the risk of repeating myself. Ethical dilemmas happen when two or more ethical standards are in conflict. When that happens, what we need to engage in is a process of ethical reasoning. This is exactly what we do when two or more ethical standards are in conflict, or when they contradict one another. I'll give you a real basic example here. Just in the real purpose of this example is simply to say that the need for ethical reasoning happens quite frequently, and that's really a function of the complex nature of what we do. So here's a really basic and generic example. We have ethical responsibilities to clients, but we also have ethical responsibilities to society as a whole. And so a sort of very basic ethical dilemma might be a time when we're advocating for a client to receive a disability payment, which might be in his or her best interest, but it might not be in the best interest of society, because it's society who's arguably making or on the hook for the sort of cost of that payment. And so in that case, what do? We have to turn to the code of ethics to understand that. Now, this isn't an actual example. We're not doing any ethical reasoning here. That's what we're going to be doing in the next couple of weeks. But the purpose of this is just to show you if we act in the best interest of the client, we're negligent in our obligation to society. On the other hand, if we act in the best interest of society, we're negligent or we're delinquent in our duties to clients. And so what do? We have to engage in a process of ethical reasoning. So important thing to remember here is that ethical reasoning is a process. It's not something that's done in an instant. It's done thoughtfully, and it's done over time. So Freud and King suggest a couple of key features of ethical reasoning. They suggest consultation with others. They suggest reflection. They suggest being aware and using emotions when appropriate. They suggest humility. And two more things. They suggest respecting the plurality of morals. That simply means that morals are heterogeneous. And there can be lots of different ways to have good and appropriate morals and values. And then the last thing, which is perhaps the most important thing for this class, Freud and King suggest acknowledging the contextual nature of ethical reasoning. And let me tell you what I mean by that here on the next slide. So the contextual nature of ethical decision-making simply means that the same two ethical standards might be in conflict in two different situations. However, the ethical reasoning might arrive at different conclusions based on the specifics of that situation. And so the conclusion is different despite the fact that the same two ethical standards are in conflict, and that's really due to the contextual nature of ethical decision-making. And so what this suggests for us is that each time we encounter an ethical dilemma, we have to start the ethical decision-making process over again. We can't simply rely on what we did before to give us a direction forward. We have to start anew. So looking ahead here, where do we go in the next couple of weeks? So first thing, remember that this is we're going to start talking about the process of ethical decision making, and remember that it is a process. Your job in some of the upcoming discussions, some of the upcoming papers and things like that will be to describe your reasoning, in effect. State your conclusion, justify your conclusion, and then give or describe a hypothetical plan of action. We're going to talk more about ethical decision-making in a couple of weeks, and I'll give you plenty of time to practice this. But some of the things that I'll be looking for in some of these upcoming activities will be your identification and citation of the relevant sections of the Code of Ethics, and then your interpretation of the meaning of these sections. And that'll all be part of the process of ethical reasoning and learning to reason in an ethical manner. So I believe that's it, and thanks for watching. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to either post on Moodle or get in touch with me. All right, thank you.